I don't quite remember the first time I realized something inside me didn't match the picture others seemed to have of me, but I can still recall the feeling of it, like a soft thread tugging at my thoughts long before I had words for any of it. It must have started in those quiet childhood afternoons when my mother would be folding laundry in the living room, the smell of warm cotton drifting through the house. I remember watching her hands as she smoothed out the little dresses my sister had worn earlier that day. Her fingers gentle and patient, as if the fabric held something delicate that needed her care. I used to pretend I was only curious about the neatness of her work, but the truth was, even then, something in me was drawn to those colors and textures in a way I didn't understand. I must have been 8 or 9 when I first brushed my fingertips across one of my sister's cardigans as it lay on the couch. It was soft and a pale yellow that reminded me of sunlight just before it fades. I remember glancing at the doorway to make sure no one was around, though back then I didn't know what I was afraid of. Maybe it was the instinct children have, the one that warns them when their curiosity steps onto terrain adults never spoke about. I pulled my hand away quickly, pretending I hadn't done anything at all, but for the rest of the day I could still feel the gentleness of that fabric, like it had stayed on my skin. Those early years are etched into me with that strange mix of innocence and confusion. I can still hear my father's voice calling me his little man while he ruffled my hair, and I remember how proud he looked when I followed him into the garage to help with odd jobs. I tried to like the smell of oil and metal. I tried to enjoy the clatter of tools and the heavy certainty of things made for fixing. But there were moments when I'd stand there holding a wrench, pretending I knew what I was doing, while some quiet part of me whispered that I belonged somewhere softer, somewhere I didn't yet know how to name. That whisper was always followed by guilt I couldn't explain, as though my secret wants were an inconvenience to the world around me. My sister, though she never knew it, was the closest thing to a mirror I had in those days. I'd watch her braid her hair in front of the hallway mirror, her small hands clumsy but determined, and sometimes she'd catch me staring. She'd roll her eyes and tell me to stop being weird, but I could never fully look away. It wasn't envy, at least not in the way people might assume. It was more like curiosity mixed with something I couldn't separate from longing. I wanted to understand what it felt like to be that at ease with softness. I wanted to touch that quiet kind of beauty, not to own it, but to feel what she felt when she looked at herself and smiled. There were moments, too, when I'd lie awake at night listening to the faint hum of the old heater in the hallway, and imagine a version of myself who didn't have to hide these thoughts. Back then the idea seemed impossible, like one of those childhood daydreams you let drift just long enough to feel it before pushing it away. I would tell myself it didn't matter, that everyone had strange ideas now and then, and that they didn't mean anything. But deep down I knew mine weren't passing fantasies. They followed me as I grew, shaping shadows in my mind that I tried so hard to ignore. The older I became, the more I built a life around the version of me that felt safest to others. I learned to talk the way boys were expected to talk, to walk with a kind of heaviness that made adults nod approvingly. I tried to let my father's pride define me. My mother would smile at me the way mothers do when they see the child they expected, rather than the one they don't know is hiding in plain sight. And my sister. Well, she grew into herself so effortlessly, unaware that every time she tossed an old scarf onto her bed or left a bracelet on her nightstand, I'd feel that same pull inside me, soft but persistent, as if inviting me to admit something I still didn't have the courage to confront. Strange, looking back now, how one small secret can change the way a person sees the entire world. I carried mine quietly, tucked behind everyday moments that to anyone else looked ordinary. But each time I felt that secret ache, it pressed a little harder, like a reminder that a part of me was waiting, patient and hidden, for the day I would finally be ready to face it. I didn't know then that the journey would one day reshape not only my understanding of myself, but the entire foundation of my marriage, my sense of manhood, and what it meant to truly be seen by someone who loved me. I suppose that's what makes those early memories feel so heavy now. They weren't just childhood curiosities. They were the first hints of a story I spent decades avoiding, a story that would eventually lead me to sign something I never imagined signing, and to discover that losing what I once thought defined me was the only way I could ever begin to understand who I really was. As the years moved forward, I learned to live with that quiet, persistent pull as though it were nothing more than an odd quirk I could tuck deep inside myself. I went to school, made friends, learned how to laugh at the right jokes, how to sit in a way that made me blend in with the boys, how to choose words that wouldn't spark questions. Became good at it. Too good, perhaps, because the better I got at hiding, the easier it became to convince myself that what I felt wasn't real, or at least didn't matter. And yet, every now and then, something would slip through the cracks of that carefully built facade. Sometimes it was something as simple as standing in a department store waiting for my mother to finish shopping, and I'd drift toward the racks of women's clothes without meaning to. I'd pretend I was bored and wandering, but really I was drawn by the soft colors, the flowing lines of skirts, the delicate patterns that seemed to hold a kind of quiet truth I couldn't put into words. I remember the way my heart would quicken when I reached out to touch a sleeve or run my fingers across a knitted collar, always checking over my shoulder, always stepping away quickly if someone came near. It wasn't that I wanted to wear them then, not exactly. It was more like they spoke a language I understood instinctively, a language that comforted me in ways I didn't let myself acknowledge. Those years were filled with moments like that. Small, passing glimpses of something I kept telling myself I wasn't allowed to feel. I pushed forward anyway, growing into adolescence, into young adulthood, into what the world told me was the path for someone like me. I dated girls not because I felt pressure to prove anything, but because I genuinely cared for them. I found joy in their laughter, in their company, in the peculiar way they could talk about feelings with an openness that seemed locked away inside my own chest. But I always felt like I was holding something back, as though there was a part of me that they couldn't reach because I refused to let it be seen. When I met the woman who would become my wife, I was in my late 20s, working a job I didn't love but had settled into because it kept life predictable. She came into my world with the sort of gentleness that made everything around her feel warmer. She had a way of paying attention to people, not just listening but hearing, noticing the small things that others overlooked. I remember thinking she was the first person who made me feel truly comfortable, as though I didn't have to brace myself for judgment with every word I spoke. Even then, though, I kept my secret buried, convincing myself that marriage would help me forget it, that love could overwrite the parts of me I was afraid to understand. Our courtship was steady and quiet in a way that suited us. We'd talk for hours about our families, our fears, our hopes. She told me stories about her childhood home, how her mother used to let her help choose fabric for curtains they'd sew together, how she loved the feeling of creating something beautiful from pieces that alone seemed insignificant. I loved the glow she carried when she talked about those memories. There were times when I envied her, not for her happiness, but for the freedom she seemed to have had to express herself openly, without fear of being misunderstood. Still, I stayed silent about my own childhood curiosities. Every time the urge surfaced to tell her about the quiet tug inside me, I'd swallow the words. I told myself it wasn't the right moment, or that it would burden her, or that I was simply being foolish. And yet, in those moments after she drifted off to sleep beside me, I'd lie awake listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, feeling a strange ache in my chest. It wasn't just fear that kept me silent. It was the belief that sharing this truth would change everything between us. Our wedding day came and went in a blur of faces and well-wishes. I can still picture her standing across from me, her eyes filled with trust and warmth, and I remember thinking that I had no right to carry a secret she didn't know existed. But I told myself that if I could just be the husband she deserved, if I could be strong enough, maybe the hidden part of me would finally fade into the background. Of course it didn't. Marriage brought a closeness I had never experienced before, and with that closeness came a deeper sense of conflict. I loved her wholeheartedly, but as the years passed, the whisper inside me grew stronger, no longer content to sit quietly in the shadows. There were nights when she'd sit at her vanity brushing her hair, and I'd watch her reflection in the mirror, feeling a kind of ache I couldn't explain. It wasn't envy and it wasn't desire. It was something softer, a longing to touch the same sense of calm she seemed to find in those small rituals of femininity. I became skilled at pretending it didn't affect me. I'd focus on work, on fixing things around the house, on being the version of myself I thought she needed. But the truth has a strange way of rising no matter how deep you bury it, and little by little I felt something shifting inside me. An unease, a quiet sadness, a sense that I was living half a life without understanding what the other half truly meant. I didn't know then that she had begun to notice. That she had seen the way I lingered a moment too long when folding her clothes, or how my eyes softened when she wore certain things, or how sometimes I seemed far away even when we sat side by side. I didn't know she was carrying her own quiet questions, waiting patiently for a moment when I'd be ready to speak. It would be years yet before that moment came, and when it did, it changed the course of both our lives in ways I never expected. But back then, in those early married years, I was still trying to pretend I was someone I wasn't. I didn't understand that love, real love, doesn't ask for masks. It asks for truth. And I had not yet learned how to give mine. The shift didn't happen all at once. Looking back, it was more like a series of small moments that at the time felt unimportant, moments I brushed off as coincidences or passing thoughts. But now, when I reflect on them, I can see how each one nudged me quietly toward the truth I'd been avoiding for so long. One evening, I remember coming home late from work, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. My wife was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, knitting something soft and light-colored. The lamp beside her cast a warm glow around the room, and for a moment I just stood there in the doorway watching her, feeling an unexpected sense of peace, as if the chaos outside had finally stopped at the threshold. She looked up at me with that gentle smile she always had when she sensed I'd had a long day. Without saying a word, she patted the cushion beside her. I sat down, and she leaned her head on my shoulder, continuing her slow, patient stitching. I remember staring at the yarn as it wove into shape and thinking how different her world felt from mine. How soothing, how free of the tension I carried without knowing how to speak of it. After a while she glanced at me and said quietly, "You look distant tonight." The comment caught me off guard. I wasn't used to being seen that clearly, not even by her. I laughed it off, told her work had been stressful. She didn't press the issue, but she studied my face a moment longer than usual, as if she could sense there was more beneath the surface. That night, after she fell asleep, I found myself standing in our dimly lit hallway staring at the closed door of her closet. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. I didn't open it. I didn't touch anything. I simply stood there with that quiet pull in my chest, feeling both drawn and afraid. I walked away before I could let my thoughts go any further, but the feeling stayed with me like a small ember that refused to go out. The next morning, she made tea while I sat at the kitchen table pretending to read the newspaper. She moved around the kitchen humming softly, an old tune her mother used to sing, she once told me. When she set the cup of tea in front of me, her fingers brushed mine for just a moment, and she paused. Not long enough to startle me, but long enough that I sensed she was debating whether to say something. In the end, she didn't. She only squeezed my hand gently before stepping away. The days that followed were filled with similar moments. Small glances, thoughtful pauses, the kind of silent understanding shared between two people who love each other deeply but don't yet know what the other is holding inside. She'd sometimes catch me staring at her reflection when she was adjusting her hair or choosing earrings for the day. And instead of teasing me the way she might have in our early years, she would simply give me a soft, knowing smile. One afternoon, months later, we were sorting old boxes in the attic. Dust coated everything, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and forgotten years. I opened a box of her childhood keepsakes, old photo albums, handmade crafts, scraps of fabric her mother had helped her sew. She sat beside me and pulled out a small, faded dress she had worn at some long-ago birthday party. It was tiny, delicate, the kind of thing a child would twirl in without a care in the world. As she held it up, she laughed softly. "I used to love this," she said. "I used to feel so pretty in it. My mother always said I looked happiest when I could dress in things that made me feel like myself." I don't know what came over me in that moment, but something about her words struck a place deep inside me, a place I'd walled off since childhood. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "I wish I knew what that felt like." It was so quiet, so unintentional, that for a second I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. But she turned toward me, her expression softening in a way I hadn't expected. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't laugh or look confused. She simply reached out and placed her hand on mine. "I think you do know," she said gently. "I just don't think you've ever had the space to say it." My breath caught. I felt exposed in a way I'd never felt before, as though she had gently pulled aside the curtain I'd spent a lifetime hiding behind. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I lowered my gaze and stared at the old wooden floorboards, unsure of what to do with the emotions rising inside me. She didn't push. She didn't ask questions or demand explanations. She just sat there with her hand resting on mine, steady and warm, giving me time to breathe. When I finally looked at her again, she gave me a small nod, as though telling me that whenever I was ready, she would listen. That moment stayed with me for weeks. It filled me with equal parts fear and relief. Fear because the truth I'd been running from all my life was finally close enough to touch. Relief because, for the first time, I realized I might not have to face it alone. But even with that realization, I hesitated. Old habits don't let go easily. I had spent years tightening the knots around my secret, and loosening them felt like betraying a version of myself I wasn't sure I was allowed to let go of. Still, something had shifted. The walls I'd built weren't as solid as before, and I began to understand that the moment would come. Maybe not that day, maybe not that month, but one day when I would have to speak my truth aloud. I didn't know that day would arrive sooner than I expected, and I certainly didn't know how profoundly it would reshape the life I thought I understood. The day everything finally surfaced was one of those soft, gray afternoons where the sky seems to be made of nothing but heavy thoughts and unasked questions. We had planned to spend the day at home, doing nothing in particular, just enjoying a rare break from the routines that had shaped our marriage. It should have been an ordinary day, but as I look back on it now, I can see how all the small, silent moments that had come before were gathering themselves into something that could no longer be ignored. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, staring at it without really seeing it. My wife had been tidying up nearby, humming the way she often did, but when she noticed how still I'd become, the humming gradually faded. She came around to the table, pulled out the chair across from me, and sat down quietly. "You've been somewhere else all day," she said softly. "Do you want to talk about it?" It was such a simple question, but the weight of it felt enormous. For a long moment I just sat there, gripping the cup like it might steady me. My breath felt caught in my chest, and a strange trembling began in my hands. She reached across the table and gently took the cup from my fingers, setting it aside as though removing one small barrier between us. "I don't want to push you," she said, "but I want to understand. I've seen something in you lately. Something tender, something hurting. And you don't deserve to carry it alone." Her voice broke something open in me. Slowly, carefully, as though I were lifting a fragile object from a dusty box, I tried to find the words that had lived inside me for decades. But when they came out uneven, halting, tangled with memories I hadn't touched since childhood. "I don't know how to say it," I whispered. "I've tried to hide it for so long. I thought it would go away." She didn't rush me. She waited, her expression calm and open, her hands folded gently on the table. I felt my throat tighten. When I was young, I always felt this pull toward things I thought I wasn't supposed to like. Things that felt soft, gentle, feminine. I didn't know what to make of it, and it scared me, so I just buried it. Her eyes softened, and she gave a faint nod for me to continue. "I never wanted to be dishonest with you," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I just didn't know how to talk about it. I still don't. I'm afraid of what it means. I'm afraid of losing everything." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "You're not going to lose me." The certainty in her voice made my eyes sting. I had spent so much of my life bracing for rejection that I didn't know what to do with acceptance when it came without hesitation. With her quiet encouragement, more words began to spill out. I told her about the moments from my childhood, the cardigan on the couch, the department store aisles, the late-night thoughts I'd tried to suffocate. I told her about the strange ache I felt whenever I watched her getting ready in the mornings, not because I wanted to be her, but because something in me longed for the same kind of expression, the same gentle rituals, the same freedom. As I spoke, her hand moved slowly across the table, coming to rest on top of mine. That small gesture felt like someone lifting a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. She didn't recoil. She didn't look shocked. She didn't ask why or how or what it meant for our future. She simply held my hand as though to say, "Keep going. I'm here." When I finally paused, drained and trembling, she squeezed my hand gently. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thank you for trusting me with this." I lowered my eyes. I don't know what to do with these feelings. I don't even know what to call them. "You don't have to call them anything yet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not expected to have all the answers right now. You've carried this alone for a long time. Just let yourself breathe." We sat there in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the confession settle between us. Not heavy but real, like a truth finally freed from hiding. Then she asked a question so gentle, so open, that it made something inside me loosen for the first time. "Have you ever wanted to express it? Even in small ways?" The question startled me. I had expected fear, maybe confusion. I had not expected understanding. My voice shook when I responded. "I have," I whispered. "But I never let myself. I didn't want to disappoint you. Or change how you saw me." She reached out and cupped my cheek with her palm, a gesture full of tenderness. "You could never disappoint me by being yourself." The tears I'd been holding back slipped down my face before I could stop them. She brushed them away with her thumb, and for the first time in my life, I felt a kind of safety I had never known before. A safety that came not from pretending, but from being seen. After a moment, she stood and walked to our bedroom. When she returned, she was holding a small, soft scarf, one I had always admired when she wore it, though I had never said so aloud. She laid it gently on the table in front of me. "If you ever want to try," she said, "you don't have to do it alone. We can figure this out together. At your pace. In your way." My breath caught as I stared at the scarf, the pale fabric glowing softly in the afternoon light. It felt like the first open door I'd ever been offered. That simple gesture, just a scarf, just an invitation, changed something profound in me. It marked the beginning of a long journey, one filled with fear and hope and hesitation, but also with a growing sense of understanding. It was the moment I first realized that maybe my truth wasn't something to run from. Maybe it was something to gently, carefully begin to live. The days that followed were quieter than usual, but not in a tense or uncomfortable way. It felt more like the house itself was holding its breath, giving me space to adjust to the truth I had finally spoken aloud. My wife didn't rush me or bring up our conversation unless I did. She simply stayed close, gentle in her presence, as though she understood that I was learning how to walk differently through my own life. I found myself lingering near the scarf she had offered me, the soft fabric folded neatly on the dresser where she left it. I would glance at it each morning before work, feeling something shift inside me that I didn't quite have the courage to name. Some days I would reach out and let my fingertips brush the fabric, just lightly, enough to feel that old sense of longing but not enough to step fully into it. Other days I'd walk past quickly, afraid that giving it too much attention would stir up emotions I wasn't ready to face. My wife noticed, of course. She always noticed. But she never commented on the way I hesitated or on the mornings when I lingered too long before turning away. She simply continued being herself, reassuring without saying much, inviting without pushing, patient in a way that made the world feel less sharp around the edges. One evening, a few weeks after our conversation in the kitchen, she approached me gently and asked if I wanted to take a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool but not cold, and the setting sun had painted the sky a deep shade of amber. We walked slowly, side by side, not speaking at first. My thoughts were tangled, but her hand brushed mine now and then, each time reminding me that I wasn't navigating this alone. Eventually she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you shared," she said softly. "And I want you to know I'm grateful. I know it wasn't easy." I nodded, the memory of that day making my chest tighten. "I'm still trying to understand it," I admitted. "There's so much I kept buried. I don't know how to make sense of it all." "You don't have to make sense of everything at once," she said. "You can explore one small step at a time. And each step can be gentle." Her voice had that steadiness that always managed to calm me, even when my thoughts were a storm. I looked down at the sidewalk, noticing the cracks in the pavement, the way the streetlights flickered on one by one. Everything around me felt familiar, yet different, as though I were seeing the world from a slightly shifted angle. After a moment I said quietly, "I don't know how to take those steps." She turned toward me with that patient, understanding expression that had comforted me countless times over the years. "Maybe the first one is just letting yourself feel what you feel," she said. "Without judging it. Without assuming it's wrong." Her words lingered in the air between us. I took them in as best I could, but the old fears didn't disappear so easily. There were memories wrapped in those fears. My father's proud declarations of what a real man should be, the silent expectations I had grown up trying to meet, the weight of the unspoken rules I had carried into adulthood. Letting myself feel freely meant unraveling all of that, thread by thread. It was overwhelming. We returned home just as the sun slipped below the horizon. Inside, the house felt warm, the soft glow of the lamps giving everything a sense of calm. My wife sat on the arm of the couch and watched me as I took off my jacket. Her eyes filled with a kind of gentle curiosity. "Would you like to talk about it?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded faintly. I sat down, feeling the cushion sink beneath me, and closed my eyes for a moment to steady myself. "It scares me," I whispered. Not the idea of expressing this part of myself, but the idea of not knowing where it leads. The idea that I'll lose control of who I am. She lowered herself onto the couch beside me and took my hand. "You're not losing control," she said softly. "You're allowing yourself to be honest. That's not losing anything. That's gaining clarity." Her words settled in my heart with a weight that felt strangely comforting. I opened my eyes and looked at her, searching her face for any sign of uncertainty or discomfort, but all I saw was warmth. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. He nodded. "Would it help if we tried something small? Something that doesn't ask anything of you except to be present with how you feel?" I felt a nervous flutter in my chest, but something within me, the part that had been waiting for years, leaned forward. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. She stood without answering immediately and walked out of the room. When she returned a moment later, she was holding the same pale scarf she had offered me weeks earlier. She sat beside me again, the fabric draped carefully across her hands. "I thought," she said gently, "that maybe you might like to feel it. Not wear it, not do anything you're not ready for. Just feel it." My breath caught in my throat. It was such a small gesture, yet it felt monumental. She held the scarf out to me, and for a moment I could only stare at it, the soft folds of fabric glowing faintly in the warm light of the living room. With trembling hands I reached out. The moment my fingers closed around the scarf, a quiet warmth spread through me. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a gentle settling of something long unsettled. The fabric was even softer than I remembered, smooth beneath my fingertips, carrying the faint scent of her perfume. Holding it felt like touching a piece of something I had lost long ago, something I had convinced myself I didn't deserve. She watched me closely, but without pressure, without expectation. "How does it feel?" she asked. I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "It feels peaceful," I whispered. "Like something inside me is finally allowed to breathe." Her smile was slow and soft, filled with quiet pride. She moved closer and rested her head on my shoulder. "Then that's enough for tonight," she said. We sat like that for a long time, the house silent around us, the scarf resting gently in my hands. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It wasn't a revelation that suddenly answered all my questions. It was simply a moment of truth, small but profound. A moment where I allowed myself to exist without hiding. And though I didn't know it then, that moment would become the first step toward something far deeper, something that would eventually reshape the very foundation of our marriage. But that night, all I knew was the softness of the scarf, the warmth of her presence, and the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, I could learn to live without the fear that had followed me for so long. The months that followed were like walking through a slow sunrise. Nothing changed all at once, and yet everything felt gradually illuminated in ways I had never experienced before. My wife and I moved carefully, gently, at a pace that allowed me to breathe through each new emotion rather than feel overwhelmed by it. She never rushed me. In fact, she often reminded me to slow down, to let each small step settle into place before considering the next. It wasn't long before she began suggesting tiny ways I might explore the parts of myself I had spent a lifetime suppressing. Not grand gestures, not dramatic leaps, just little moments that invited me to feel present, honest, and safe. Sometimes it meant letting the scarf rest around my shoulders for a few minutes in the privacy of our living room. Other times it meant sitting together as she showed me how certain fabrics made her feel calm, or how colors affected her mood, or how pieces of clothing could express things that words struggled to hold. I never would have admitted it out loud then, but each of those moments felt like a long exhale after years of holding my breath. There were evenings when I felt brave enough to wrap the scarf a little more securely around myself, letting the softness fall where it naturally would. There were afternoons when she would lay out a few gentle fabrics on the bed and simply let me touch them, as though inviting my hands to remember something my heart had known since childhood. And there were nights, quiet, steady nights, when I would stand in front of the mirror while she stood beside me, saying nothing, just letting me look at myself without judgment. Those nights were some of the hardest. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because I had to confront years of fear, shame, and confusion reflected back at me. But she stood there every time, her hand either resting lightly on my back or simply nearby, close enough to remind me that I wasn't alone in the reflection. Slowly, I began to understand that this wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It wasn't about abandoning who I had been. It was about expanding, unfolding, giving myself permission to hold parts of me I had long denied. It was about identity in the quietest, most human sense, an identity that had been whispering to me since childhood. One evening, as autumn settled into the world, my wife sat beside me on the bed and handed me a small envelope. Her expression was thoughtful, a little nervous, though she tried to hide it. "I've been thinking about something," she said softly. "Something that might help you feel more grounded, more affirmed." I opened the envelope slowly, expecting perhaps another scarf or a note of encouragement. But what I found inside made my breath catch. It was a simple piece of paper. Few sentences. A quiet agreement. Something she had drafted herself. It wasn't legal. It wasn't binding in any official sense. But it carried a commitment that went deeper than anything a document could offer. At the top she had written, "The Sissy Contract," a title she later admitted she chose not to tease or belittle, but because she wanted to reclaim a word I had been afraid of all my life. Underneath it, a series of gentle promises. A promise that I could explore myself without fear. A promise that she would guide me when I needed guidance and step back when I needed space. A promise that my identity, however it grew, however it changed, was safe with her. There was a line for me to sign and a line for her to sign. My hands trembled as I held it. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything. You're not losing your manhood or your strength or anything that makes you who you are. You're choosing honesty. You're choosing to grow. And I want to grow with you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "It feels like I'm giving up something." She touched my cheek gently. "Maybe what you're giving up is the fear. Maybe what you're signing away isn't your manhood, but the pain of pretending." Her words broke me open in a way I hadn't expected. I felt tears spill down my face before I even realized I was crying. She took my hands in hers and waited, patient as ever, until I found enough breath to sign the paper. When she signed her name beside mine, she leaned her forehead against mine and whispered, "This is our journey now." And in that moment, it felt like something inside me finally settled, like a long, restless chapter of my life had gently closed so a new one could begin. It wasn't about the scarf or the clothes, or even the contract itself. It was about honesty, about choosing to live without shrinking from the truth that had shaped me all my life, about allowing myself to become whole. Our path wasn't always smooth after that. There were days of uncertainty, Days when old fears resurfaced. Days when I questioned everything. But each step brought a new understanding, a new sense of calm. And with her by my side, guiding me with her steady warmth, I learned that acceptance isn't a sudden realization. It's a lifelong unfolding. Now, when I look back across the years, across the moments of childhood curiosity, the long-hidden fears, the whispered confessions, the unexpected tenderness, I realize that my journey wasn't about changing who I was. It was about finally discovering who I had always been. And if there's one thing I've learned that I wish I could pass on to anyone listening, it's this: courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a quiet voice, trembling in the dark, saying, "This is who I am," and trusting that someone will hear it with kindness. Thank you for listening to my story. And truly, from the heart, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel.